Nau mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. For those who don't know me, my name is Nick Smith and I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the Victoria University of Wellington Te Herenga Waka. And it's my huge pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight, friends, family, distinguished guests, academic and professional colleagues, students, and our wider community, to the inaugural lecture of Nikki Hessell, Professor of Romantic Literature. I tried to convince Nikki in the conversation we've just had to tell me something that would be fun and interesting and slightly embarrassing, and she very steadfastly refused, and so I'm confident that the entertainment will come in her lecture. But the reason I wanted to do that was the list of her achievements is long and imposing, and I don't think does justice to the humanity and energy that she's brought to this university. Professor Hessel completed her BA Honours in English and her Master of Arts with distinction in English at this fine university before she headed north to the University of Toronto, where she did her PhD in English. Her interest is in romantic literature, and that was first sparked for her when she was taught here by now Emeritus Professor Hayley Thompson, a hugely respected academic in this university, many of whom who will know. Professor Hessel tells me that she was immediately drawn to the intellectual world of Romanticism, with its focus on issues which I think are important today as much as they ever have been: environment, self-reflection, political and social change. Professor Hessel has taken those concepts and evolved from that PhD into an internationally recognised expert in 18th century British Romantic literature. She's particularly interested in the intersection of British print culture and Indigenous people's writing and the relationship between journalism and literature. And this is evidenced in her many outputs. One of the most notable recent ones is her highly regarded book published in 2021, Sensitive Negotiations, Indigenous Diplomacy and British Romantic Poetry. Alongside her stellar research career, her many contributions to teaching, she's also held leadership roles in this university and contributed both formally and informally in those facets. She's known for the spirit of collegiality and collaboration that she brings to these. As Associate Dean Equity in her faculty, as Deputy Head of the School of English, Film, Theatre and Media Communications and Art History, and as Programme Director for English Literature and Creative Communications. In this lecture, Professor Hessel will focus on the work of William Wordsworth, who I think we see on the slides in front of us. She will discuss the way that his poetry can help us understand the intellectual worlds of the early Pākehā settlers. She will outline the continuing importance of romantic literature for life that moves from those early days with the early Pākehā settlers to today in 21st century Aotearoa. It's in that context that I'm greatly looking forward to Professor Hessell's lecture. Her understanding of romantic literature and what that culture can tell us about the world that we live in today, and how we can, through her eyes, gain an understanding of countries like ours and how they've ended up the way that they are. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Nikki Hessell.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's lovely to see everyone here. I'm just scanning the room, looking at all the faces. Before I start into the lecture proper, there's just some people in the room and beyond that I'd like to acknowledge tonight. First of all, my family, who are occupying a lot of the seats on the left-hand side of the room, and especially Carwyn and our children who are here in the front row. Secondly, our students. I know there are former and current students who've registered for the talk tonight. I think it's quite hard to get across to the students how appreciated and cared for they are. So this is just to say to all of you that we really value what you do in our classrooms, the work that you produce, and what you do beyond when we see you leave the institution and all the things that you're capable of. I did enjoy the students who emailed me and said, "Oh, I'm not coming in person, but I'll watch the recording." It's the story of my life. But the messages from students were really, really appreciated, people who can't be here and some of whom are overseas. Thirdly, I'd like to thank friends from other parts of my life, and especially my friends from high school who are here. No one really knows you as well as the people who knew you when you were very young. The Vice-Chancellor has asked me for funny stories. I've refused to supply them, and so perhaps you could all help him out later. But I'm very lucky to have you in my life, and we're very lucky to have raised our children as a group together, I think. And finally, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues, academic and professional, in my own wonderful program, English Literatures and Creative Communication, in my school, Sefton's Car, in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and across the university, and the other faculties and campuses, and I can see people here for the other campuses tonight. I can also see Elizabeth Gray from Massey, and I started my academic career at Massey University, so across the sector, shall we say. All of you, but especially the ALC program, make this job such a joy and such a pleasure to teach alongside you. Just amongst those groups of colleagues, I would like to just acknowledge three very special groups. First of all, the people who are my colleagues now, but once upon a time were my lecturers. As Nick said, I'm a graduate of this institution. I've had the rare privilege of teaching alongside people who taught me, not just in English, but in other disciplines as well. And I wasn't always the most diligent and attentive undergraduate student, mind on other things. But I thank you so much. I thank you so much for your time, your investment in me as a student and then as a colleague. And I hope that seeing me standing here tonight is abundant recompense, as Wordsworth would say. Second, I'd like to acknowledge all of the colleagues, academic and professional, who in the last few months have either taken voluntary redundancy or who have had their jobs disestablished. Occasions like this evening focus our mind on individual achievement, but we all know in this room that there are no individual achievements at a university. We get where we are because we're part of a community of academic staff and professional staff and students who work together and put this massive collective effort around what we want to do. I've been the beneficiary of an extraordinary level of generosity from colleagues, academic and professional, especially in my own program. That's going to be more difficult, I think, for us to maintain now that we have fewer and fewer staff members. So what I'd like to say to all the colleagues who are leaving, whatever the circumstances, just a reminder, our country is immeasurably weaker because of decisions that have been taken in tertiary policy and funding in the last 2 decades. And I'm immeasurably weaker for the loss of all of you. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge one very special group of colleagues who are very close to my heart. When I was an undergraduate here in the 1990s, there had only ever been one woman professor of English. I wasn't actually ever taught by Joan Stevens. She had long since retired before I joined the university as a student. But I'd like to acknowledge her tonight and to think about what an extraordinary achievement and probably quite a lonely achievement it was to be the first woman professor of English here. When I joined the staff in 2011, Catherine Walls had just been promoted to professor. I think I saw Catherine. There she is. Hi, Catherine. And it was actually at my first school meeting that Catherine's promotion was announced. Since then, we've had a veritable bonanza. First, Jane Stafford, who's down the back there. Then Hayley Thompson, who Nick mentioned is my wonderful mentor and friend. Hayley sends her apologies, she's not well today, so she won't be able to come along. And last year, it was my great pleasure to sit down with my dear friend Sarah Ross and plan how we were both going to get to Professor, work on our applications together and sort of drag ourselves and each other over the line. And the day we found out we'd both been promoted was a very, very exciting day indeed. Sarah and I can have an argument later about which of us is the fifth and which of us is the sixth woman professor of English. I haven't given this a lot of thought, but you'll notice I got myself to the podium first. Anyway, it's a great honour to stand here as either the fifth or the sixth woman professor of English at Te Waka and say that's not really a thing. We don't talk about who the fifth and the sixth people are. People don't argue about it because by the time you're getting to those kind of numbers, you can be fairly sure as a group that you've built a pathway that other people will be able to follow. And you don't need to focus on that quite so much anymore. Engari, wahine Pākehā mā. We know the great paradox of white women the world over. which is that it's genuinely very hard for us to get to these positions, and you only have to look at the professorial announcements to know that that's true, and much, much easier for us than it is for women of colour. To put it in the most local terms, we know that Te Sia didn't get to be a professor. So, I'm very proud of this. I'm going to celebrate with you all tonight, but let's all get up tomorrow and build a better university. On with the lecture. In 1841, when the New Zealand Company drew up its map for the proposed settlement of Wellington, it named 4 streets in the area that we now know as the Aroa Valley: Aroa Street, Mount Street, Epuni Street, and Wordsworth Street. Locals will be familiar with the first of those 3 names, but might be struggling to place Wordsworth Street on their mental map of the area. That's because Wordsworth Street was renamed. It was the part of Aroa Street between Mount and Willis, and it was later enfolded into Aroa Street and took on that name. Wordsworth Street was named for the great Romantic poet William Wordsworth, who was still alive in 1841 when this map was drawn up. I want to use this moment of flickering, when his name appears and then disappears from our local landscape, to think about what Romantic poetry has to teach us about Pākehā history and identity, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. Justice Sir Joe Williams once said that the nation-state of New Zealand was founded by 2 peoples, Cook's people and Kupe's people. Tonight I'd like to consider what it means to read Romantic poetry as one of Cook's people. That is, not just as a white reader or a settler reader, but quite specifically as a Pākehā reader, someone shaped by the connections between Cook's people and Kupe's people on these islands. One of the extraordinary gifts Pākehā were given on the 6th of February 1840 was the chance to look anew at the traditions and cultures we had come from, to consider them from the perspective of Aotearoa and the arrangement that was forged that day. One of co-governance, yes, but also one of co-creation, of knowledge systems that would entwine and change each other. The Romantic period of literary history is a very short one, and we usually choose 2 dates as the conventional starting and ending points for it: the onset of the French Revolution in 1789 and the passage of the Great Reform Act in Britain in 1832. It was a time of massive upheaval and change in Europe. But those dates are quite arbitrary ones, and if we look at them closely, if we look at them from these islands, we can see the shadow of another set of meaningful dates that would work just as well. The period between 1769 and Cook's arrival in the Pacific and 1840 and the signing of Te Tiriti covers the early period of relations between Māori and Pākehā and is a very close match with the Romantic period. There is a dense circularity to this overlap. The Romantic writers who emerged in the wake of 1769 were deeply influenced by Cook's voyages and the knowledge, experiences and imperialist actions he encountered or perpetrated. In turn, Romantic poetry was the literature that early Pākehā arrivals in Aotearoa, especially from the 1820s onwards, brought with them in literal books, but also in their hearts and their heads. So my pitch to you this evening is that the influence here is like a constant reverberation. Romantic poetry can be read really effectively from the perspective of Cook's people, or indeed Kupe's people, but that's not my story to tell, and can likewise help us understand the way Cook's people behaved then, behave now, and might choose to behave in the future. To do this, I'm going to focus on William Wordsworth himself and use 4 different poems to suggest 4 different ways that his poetry might inform what we know of our past, present and future. I'm taking inspiration here from Maria Barge's inaugural. I can't see Maria. Oh, there she's hiding. Maria gave a wonderful inaugural earlier in the year where she used 4 stories to tell the story of Māori governance. And so I'm hoping to kind of kick myself off that foundation that she laid, but also to question methodologically some of what underpins the idea of an inaugural. To inaugurate something is to commence something, to begin it. But it implies that atomised and highly individualised, starting from scratch idea of knowledge that we sometimes think of as characterising universities, although that's not my actual experience of how the university operates. But there's no blank space here in which you get to write my name, no terra nullius of knowledge that I get to inscribe with my own ideas. I hope that by responding to Maria, I can model not an inaugural, but maybe a continual, into which we each bring some insight or experience we've gained in our careers, and most significantly, gained from listening to and collaborating with each other. A little about Wordsworth first of all. He was born in Cumbria in 1770, the year after Cook arrived in the Pacific. His parents died when he was quite young, and he and his siblings were sent to live with different relatives and raised apart from one another. In the late 1790s, now adults, Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy set up a home together in Grasmere in the Lake District. While he was living in Grasmere, Wordsworth embarked on a series of poems called Poems on the Naming of Places. This group of poems recounted the Wordsworth Circle's practice of assigning names to places of significance to them in their new home. When he published these poems in 1800, Wordsworth included a short and very revealing headnote about his poems. By persons resident in the country and attached to rural objects, many places will be found unnamed or of unknown names, where little incidents will have occurred or feelings been experienced, which will have given to such places a private and peculiar interest. From a wish to give some sort of record to such incidents or renew the gratification of such feelings, names have been given to places by the author and some of his friends, and the following poems written in consequence. We can see some fairly clear parallels here between what Wordsworth is thinking and the conduct of Cook or Joseph Banks or any other number of settler invaders the world over. To put it simply, the implication is that it's okay to arrive somewhere new and overlay a set of names onto the landscape, based on your own impressions of what's important. It doesn't matter too much whether the places are actually unnamed or whether the names are just unknown to you. You can embark on a naming process based on your own private and peculiar interest. In his book, The Road to Botany Bay, the Australian scholar Paul Carter pointed out that Cook and Banks had quite different approaches to their naming practices. Banks was a scientist, and he tended to think in terms of taxonomies. If he was giving a name to a place, he would try to fit it into a system of names, making it consistent with what he'd done so far. Cook was, by profession and temperament, an explorer, and tended to give names based on two principles: wanting to please someone by naming something after them, like Mount Edgecombe, the English name he gave to Pūtawaki, or wanting to record his impressions of a place, like the name the Bay of Plenty. And I've chosen those two names as examples because I was born in Whakatane, in that part of the country. You can see in Wordsworth's note here that he operates in the way that Cook did, impressionistic, personal, gratifying his friends. How does this manifestation of Cook's mentality play out in Wordsworth's poems? We can see it in an example like A Narrow Girdle of Rough Stones and Crags. In this poem, Wordsworth and his friends are out walking, when suddenly, through a thin veil of glittering haze, we saw before us, on a point of jutting land, the tall and upright figure of a man, attired in peasant's garb, who stood alone, angling beside the margin of the lake. That way we turned our steps, nor was it long ere, making ready comments on the sight which then we saw, with one and the same voice, we all cried out that he must be indeed an idle man, who thus could lose a day of the mid-harvest, when the labourer's hire is ample, and some little might be stored wherewith to cheer him in the winter time. Thus, talking of that peasant, we approached close to the spot where with his rod and line he stood alone, whereat he turned his head to greet us, and we saw a man worn down by sickness, gaunt and lean, with sunken cheeks and wasted limbs, his legs so long and lean that for my single self I looked at them forgetful of the body they sustained. Too weak to labour in the harvest field, the man was using his best skill to gain a pittance from the dead, unfeeling lake that knew not of his wants. I will not say what thoughts immediately were ours, nor how the happy idleness of that sweet morn, with all its lovely images, was changed to serious musing and to self-reproach. Nor did we fail to see within ourselves what need there is to be reserved in speech and temper all our thoughts with charity. Therefore, unwilling to forget that day, my friend, myself, and she who then received the same admonishment have called the place by a memorial name, uncouth indeed as ere by mariner was given to bay, or foreland on a new discovered coast, and Point Rash Judgment is the name it bears. The critic David Simpson was the first person to point out how similar this name is to one of Cook's names. Point Rash Judgment, with its reminder of an impression or feeling associated with a place, chimes with many of Cook's choices: Poverty Bay, Cape Farewell, Doubtful Sound. Wordsworth himself is aware of this connection and writes it into the poem, not only in these final lines with the idea of a mariner giving a name to a bay, but also in his first encounter with the man, which closely resembles sailing up to someone else's country. So here is the first of the 4 lessons I take when I, as one of Cook's people, read Wordsworth. Cook had a profound influence on romantic writers like Wordsworth, who in turn could provide poetic ballast to 19th century settlers for the idea that such colonial processes were justified and perhaps even morally useful as reminders of one's own experiences and histories. But poetry is more complicated than that, and a writer of Wordsworth's talent and intellect is unlikely to provide such a one-dimensional or baldly political reading. So let's look at another of the poems on the naming of places, this one called It Was an April Morning, Fresh and Clear. In this poem, Wordsworth's speaker has turned suddenly into a little dell in the course of his walk, and he writes, I gazed and gazed, and to myself I said, our thoughts at least are ours, and this wild nook, my Emma, I will dedicate to thee. Soon did the spot become my other home, my dwelling and my out-of-doors abode. And of the shepherds who have seen me there, to whom I sometimes in our idle talk have told this fancy, 2 or 3, perhaps, years after we are gone and in our graves, when we have cause to speak of this wild place, may call it by the name of Emma's Dell. This poem approaches the question of naming quite differently than the last one, and not just because the name Wordsworth chooses doesn't have the obvious Cook-like sound to it. Emma was the kind of poetic name he gave for his sister Dorothy, so he's actually talking about Dorothy here, but he names her Emma. And I was in the Lake District recently, and it's quite commercialised now, and there's a crepe shop called Emma's Dell, which Wordsworth would have hated the whole idea of it. Wordsworth here investigates the question of the durability of these newly bestowed names. At first, it seems that the naming process has allowed the speaker to claim the space. It is my other home, my dwelling, and my out-of-doors abode. But that confident proclamation that one can take possession simply by naming is quickly undermined by all the conditional vocabulary and the little glimpse of the future that follows. And of the shepherds, so a subject section of the group of shepherds who have seen me there, to whom I sometimes in our idle talk have told this fancy, 2 or 3 perhaps, years after we are gone and in our graves, when they have cause to speak of this wild place, may call it by the name of Emma's Dell. Wordsworth is very aware here of the tenuousness of the name he's bestowed, and he writes that awareness into the poem. The name, it seems, is very unlikely to outlive his own circle, and more significantly, the power to invest the name with any kind of durability rests with the locals, not with Wordsworth and his family. You can call places whatever you like privately, Wordsworth seems to say, but you can't insist that other people adopt the name, particularly those who have lived there for centuries. You can tell them which name you use, and they can choose to adopt it, but most likely they will not grant it any authority. In time, those names will just peel away and be forgotten. And he's right. This has happened in my lifetime. I was born in Whakatane. I grew up in the shadow of Pūtawaki and Whakaari, which we would have called Mount Edgecombe and White Island, although I have to concentrate quite hard to remember now what the English names were. Even Cook's name, which we might have expected to be the one that would endure, is melting away, as Aoraki can testify. So here is the second lesson I take when I, as one of Cook's people, read Wordsworth. He absorbs Cook's approach and he provides poetic ballast for colonial naming processes. But he also encodes a necessary uncertainty about the likely outcome of this practice and can thus be read as cautioning the settler populations who loved his poetry not to imagine that they can insist on a nomenclature without political or community consent, and to understand that any naming process undertaken in this arbitrary way would not endure. Part of the reason Cook and co believed they could name places is that they didn't really accept the permanence of names that weren't written down. The absence of what Europeans regarded as legible maps, signs and markers was often taken as evidence that names simply did not exist for those places, or they existed in a way that had no standing or authority. But Wordsworth's poems in 1800 challenged that idea. In another poem from the 1800 collection called The Brothers, Wordsworth extends this conversation beyond place names and into wider histories and knowledges. This long poem, which is partly written as a dialogue, focuses on Leonard, a man who is returning to his native village after a long time away and hoping to find out if his brother James is still alive. He looks in the local cemetery, but he can't decode or comprehend the information there, so can't decipher whether his brother is buried there. He encounters the parish priest, who explains to him that the locals use the landscape as a record of their history. Leonard then says to him, "Yet your churchyard seems, if such freedom may be used with you, to say that you are heedless of the past. Here's neither head nor footstone, plate of brass, crossbones or skull, type of our earthly state or emblem of our hopes. The dead man's home is but a fellow to that pasture field." And the priest replies, "Why, there, sir, is a thought that's new to me. The stonecutters, 'tis true, might beg their bread if every English churchyard were like ours. Yet your conclusion wanders from the truth. We have no need of names and epitaphs. We talk about the dead by our firesides." Wordsworth depicts here the tight connection between land, occupancy, community, protocols, and naming. Names have to be brought out and used, recounted and recalled, shared between people and remembered if they are to be meaningful records. But as long as that is happening, there's no need for them to be written down, carved in stone, or inscribed on maps. A community's collective knowledge, its sense of itself, its names and its stories, is enough to ensure the authority of a name and its place in both history and geography. But this poem also reminds the reader that this is not an automatic or passive process. The tragedy of Leonard's experience in The Brothers is that despite being from this village, he can't interpret it anymore. The poem tells us that he's been a mariner and away at sea for 20 years, and he's thus become so detached from the place that he's not recognised by the priest and has not been part of the storytelling and record keeping that has kept these names alive. In fact, as the poem later reveals, his brother James has died, and Leonard leaves again to return to sea. This poem thus speaks to the possibility of becoming detached from traditional knowledge, losing the ability to read and interpret the names, the landscapes that we did know or might have known. It's a process that Pākehā inflicted violently on Māori and that we allowed to happen to ourselves. But while Wordsworth's poem keeps us very focused on Leonard and the tragedy of both his bereavement and his loss of connection with his home, the figure of the priest is a reminder that as long as someone remembers, as long as someone is doing the work of using, recording, sharing the names, of keeping those stories alive, there is always a way back to those knowledges. So here is the third lesson I take when I, as one of Cook's people, read Wordsworth. He absorbs Cook's approach and he provides poetic ballast for colonial naming processes, and he encodes a necessary uncertainty about the tenuousness of an imported nomenclature. But he also teaches us, as Cook's people, as Pākehā, that we already knew how to value traditional knowledges that were recorded in stories and passed down through oral narratives, and that we knew and were very fearful of the tragic cost of becoming detached from those stories by becoming detached from the land. Wordsworth meditates on the tenuousness of newly applied names and the great sadness that comes from losing traditional knowledge, in part because he does know what durable names sound like, where they come from, and how they can endure, persist and flourish. In another poem, in Poems on the Naming of Places, he describes sitting with his sister-in-law Joanna Hutchinson and hearing her laughter echo off a rock that he ends up calling Joanna's Rock. But this is how he records the sound of her laughter in the setting. The rock, like something starting from a sleep, took up the lady's voice and laughed again. That ancient woman seated on Helm Crag was ready with her cavern. Hamascar and the tall steep of Silverhouse sent forth a noise of laughter. Southern Loffrig heard and Fairfield answered with a mountain tone. Helvellyn far into the clear blue sky carried the lady's voice. Old Skiddaw blew his speaking trumpet. Back out of the clouds of Glaramara, southward came the voice, and Kirkstone tossed it from his misty head. Joanna's laughter rings around the valley, and Wordsworth is able to trace its progress as the sound bounces off each of the local peaks and mountains. The mountains all have names that encode a long history of natural observation. Some elements of the names are Old or Middle English, some are Old Norse, some are the Cumbrian dialect that emerges out of Welsh, and those languages are sedimented like the rocks themselves, containing a geological history of the landscape. They not only describe each peak, but place them in relation to the landscape around them. Loughrigg means a ridge above a lake, while Helmcrag means a hilltop above a cliff. Some describe the particular appearance of the peak. How derives from the Old Norse word for hill, so Silver How is the Silver Hill, while Skiddaw is from the Old Norse for a jutting crag, but also implied the idea of an archer's hill, somewhere to station yourself. Skiddaw's the little spiky one that does indeed look like somewhere an archer could fire from. Some rely on very detailed local ecological knowledge. Helvellyn probably comes from the Cumbrian words for a pale yellow moor, which seems like a very strange way to describe a mountain, until you know that local shepherds used to evaluate the quality of the grass on the peaks based on its colour. And because the snow lingers so long on Helvellyn, well into the summer, it produced a yellow-coloured grass. Wordsworth can name all of these peaks, and he can trace the progress of the echo of Joanna's laughter. He doesn't need a map of the kind that you can see here. More than that, he knows the stories associated with each of these names. He included a note on this poem to explain the reference to the ancient woman. On Helmcrag, that impressive single mountain at the head of the Vale of Grasmere, is a rock which from most points of view bears a striking resemblance to an old woman cowering. His poem records each peak's response and understands the peaks as living beings, interacting with each other and with him and Joanna. The mountains heard and answered. They are endowed with pronouns that indicate they are, in Wordsworth's mind, alive and in relation with him. That ecological, geological and historical knowledge contained in place names is something we, as Cook's people, might associate exclusively with Māori names, but that's because we've become accustomed to the superficial way English names were spread across these islands, as grace and favour gifts to the patrons who never set foot here or gave this country a moment's thought, or as notations of a fleeting and often misguided encounter with the landscape by Cook and others. It's not that the English language can't encode that kind of deep knowledge. It's that naming practices have to be forged out of a profound connection with the land and its uses, worked out across centuries and millennia, aware of each natural feature as a relation and as a member of our community, respectful of the uses to which it can be put sustainably, and generated through a people's shared understanding of the landscape stories. Wordsworth's poetry reminds us that Pākehā settlers who loved his writing and carried his verses with them did have at their disposal an understanding of what it meant to be tangata whenua. One tragedy of colonisation is that we didn't apply that understanding when we came here and act in accordance with the tikanga that tangata whenua laid out for us. So here is the fourth and final lesson I take when I, as one of Cook's people, read Wordsworth. He absorbs Cook's approach and he provides poetic ballast for colonial naming process. You can tell I'm a lecturer. And he encodes a necessary uncertainty about the tenuousness of an imported nomenclature. And he teaches us, as Cook's people, as Pākehā, that we already knew how to value traditional knowledges that were recorded in stories and passed down through oral narratives, and that we knew and were fearful of the tragic cost of becoming detached from those stories by becoming detached from the land. But he also provides us evidence of what a deep, authentic, relational approach to place and to naming looked like from a British perspective. The Romantic authors understood this point. Thomas de Quincey, another great Romantic writer, who actually lived in Wordsworth's house in Grasmere after the Wordsworth family outgrew it, and thus also lived in the shadow of these exact same mountains, wrote in his essay on style, "Why are the local names, whenever they have resulted from the general and good sense of a country, faithful to the local truth, grave and unaffected? Simply because they are not inventions of any active faculty, but mere passive depositions from a real impression on the mind. On the other hand, wherever there is an ambitious principle set in motion for name inventing, there it is sure to terminate, and something monstrous and fanciful. We have a lot of monstrous and fanciful names to deal with in this country. Let me take this. I was born in Whakatane, as I mentioned, in the place that Cook called the Bay of Plenty, in the shadow of the mountain he called Edgecombe. But when I was a teenager, we moved to Hamilton. Nick wanted some stories about my life. Here they come. We moved to Hamilton, and we lived on Nixon Street. The whole time I was living there, I genuinely believed that that street was named for Richard Nixon, the American president. And that would be bad enough in itself. But the truth is actually much worse. That street is named for Marmaduke Nixon, who led the 1864 cavalry attack on Aotearoa, an unfortified site where Māori women, children and karaua were sheltering. It's one of the most serious war crimes to have happened in this country. So when I read Wordsworth's poetry from 1800, some of the questions I ask myself as one of Cook's people are these. Do we, as Pākehā, want to commemorate the murderers and the war criminals? Are those the people whose names we think should represent us on this landscape? Do we want a city named after John Hamilton? Or streets in that city named after Marmaduke Nixon, or John Bryce, or George Grey? Or did our ancestors in fact come to Aotearoa with another way of knowing, another way of engaging with the land, with its traditions, with tangata whenua, that we could have chosen and can still choose? I think Wordsworth's poetry provides us with a deep insight into the Pākehā psyche, a psyche that was formed in the Romantic period. Our appropriativeness and our acquisitiveness, our anxiety and our fragility, but also provides us with a reminder of our own deeply buried protocols and knowledges that could have helped our ancestors be good treaty partners and could still help us with that task today. Wordsworth was Poet Laureate for the last 7 years of his life, from 1843 to 1850. He was actually a very conservative man by this point in his life, but he was still the author of those earlier poems. And it's really poems like those I've shared with you tonight on which his reputation rests, and those poems which would have led the New Zealand Company in 1841 to want to name a street after him. Because he was Poet Laureate of Great Britain, he was, by default, Poet Laureate of the New Dominion of New Zealand from 1843 to 1850. What might the 1840s and beyond have looked like if our tepuna Pākehā had engaged more seriously with the deep lessons of Wordsworth's poems? What if, instead of choosing to be Cook's people, we had chosen to be Wordsworth's people? What if, metaphorically at least, we had decided that we were going to dwell on Wordsworth Street? Thank you.
E nā mana, e nā reo, e nā karangataka maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi nui ki a koutou kua te mai nei I tēnei pō, ki te whakarongo, ki te koho ahorangi, Nikki Hessell. Ko Sarah Leggett toku ingoa, ko aho te amo o te wāhanga aronui. Good evening, I'm Sarah Leggett. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Te Wāhanga Aronui, and it's my privilege this evening to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of all of us here to Nikki Hessell for her compelling inaugural lecture as Professor of English Literatures at Te Herenga, Victoria University of Wellington, focusing on the romantic poetry of William Wordsworth. Nikki's lecture this evening has illustrated why she is so highly regarded nationally and internationally as a scholar who brings a fresh and innovative approach to the study of romantic literature, offering new perspectives on Romanticism's central political, aesthetic and cultural preoccupations, foregrounding important issues of place, cultural identity, community and whakapapa, helping us to see the relevance of romantic literature to Pākehā history and identity, and to contemporary discussions in Aotearoa about the legacy of our colonial past. Many of us here this evening will have read, studied, appreciated, and enjoyed the work of the British Romantics over the years. we will have understood that the Romantic poets were drawing on a different sense of physical space and on different landscapes than those we know, the English meadows, forests and peaks, rather than the tussock grass, fern and flax of Aotearoa. That they were offering social and political commentary from a different physical and intellectual world. I suspect that few of us here would have considered the close parallels between the histories of Cook and Wordsworth, the deep circularity and interconnection that Nikki has articulated so eloquently this evening, the premise that Wordsworth poetry can shed light on the actions of Cook's people in the past, present, and indeed the future. Through her beautiful reading and analysis of 4 poems, Nikki has shown us how Wordsworth poetry can be read as informing our history, our contemporary moment, and our future here in this land. Weaving into her discussion her own whakapapa as one of Cook's people who grew up in the Bay of Plenty and Hamilton, the central tenet of Nikki's argument is that these poems offer us important lessons. Lessons about colonial naming practices, about the tenuous nature of nomenclature, about the importance of valuing traditional knowledges and the immense cost of losing our stories and our connection to the land, and a reminder of how Wordsworth and his contemporaries understood a deep and authentic approach to place. Nikki's Inaugural has provided a space for us to pause and reflect on these lessons she's drawn from her interpretation and analysis of Wordsworth's poetry, and she has compellingly made the case that these are of continued relevance to us today in Aotearoa. I think some of us will go away from this lecture and want to reread and revisit Wordsworth's work from the perspective of our own identities as Cook's people, as Pākehā, and consider what lessons we might take from his poems. But that aside, what I also believe Nikki has given us this evening is a moment to inhabit and absorb some beautiful poetry, read and discussed very eloquently by a world-renowned expert. Tēnā rātou atu koe, Nikki. We're enormously appreciative and extremely fortunate to have you as a scholar and a colleague at Te Herenga Waka. It's now my pleasure to invite everyone to stay and join us for refreshments through in the Hunter Common Room. But before we adjourn there, please join me in once again thanking Professor Nikki Hessell for an excellent inaugural lecture. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Nikki.